Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, the live TV show all about the legal aspects of your business to help educate you on complex legal terms in an easy to understand manner, to help understand why you need to do certain things in your business from a legal point of view, and to help you develop a plan for the future. Our mission at Business Legal Lifecycle is to help empower all small to medium-sized businesses around the world to get access to legal advice so that they can help build their communities and make the world a better place.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV. Today is one of our education shows where we go through a particular topic in depth, and today we're talking about finding your ideal client, and then further to that, once you've found your ideal client, engaging with your actual client and customers and the sort of documents that you need. I am Craig Mason, and I have with me, as always, Jeremy Stretton. Say hello to everyone, please, Jeremy.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a great day.
Excellent. So as I said, today's the education show. It's show 156. At the end of it, there will be the show notes available as always. So I encourage everyone to check those out. And if you've got any questions, please get in contact with us through the various channels. So as I said, we're talking about finding your ideal client, which we think is a very important thing to do. A lot of businesses don't do it, but it's an important thing to go through, and then engaging with your particular customers. So, Jeremy, how does this fit into the phases of the business legal lifecycle?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So the way this is phase 3 of the business legal lifecycle, being initial clients, and basically this is all about setting yourself up so that you can find your clients and then engage with them properly. So that's what we're going to talk about today, as Craig said, and we'll kick off with who is your ideal client and why that's important, and then we'll talk about how to find an ideal client, building a client avatar, talking about how you use that in your business, and then we'll talk about basically setting up engagement forms and all the rest of it. So, Craig, I'll kick off with who is your ideal client, and basically that is really who is the person that you want to work with. So you need to think about who the person is that you want to work with and where you're going to make the most money. So, in 2018, when we're recording this, there's so many subject matter experts that it's very hard and impossible to be all things to all people. So don't even try. Be the person who can help out as many people as you can in your ideal client avatar. So that's why you need to build one. You need to build one so that you can find those right people and really build on your business and build your niche into who it is. You can also, a lot of people think, talk about ideal client personas. It's the same thing. And so, that's what's really important, is to build your client avatar and think about who that person is. So think about who you want to work with and then build out the avatar. So Craig, do you want to kick off with building the client avatar and the kind of details that you're looking for?
Yeah, okay. So as Jeremy said, you're building a client avatar. So that's your ideal client, and you need to work out all the details around that person. So it's not just a simple matter of saying, my ideal client is a plumber. You need to go into a bit more detail than that and build an actual client avatar. So in order to do that, the best way is to sit down and think about all the little details about the particular person or business that you're wanting as your ideal client, and going through all the details. At the end of it all, you'll have a client avatar that'll be, my client is Bob Simpson. He's 42 years of age. He runs 2 businesses, etc., etc. Lives in the Gold Coast, drives a Honda Accord. All those sorts of things will build into your client avatar, and then what your ideal client is in order to do that. So the best way that we found to build your client avatar is to go through a number of questions, and then from that you get the answers to do it. So you've got personal details is the first section that we find to go through. So you've got marital status, school, children, where they might live, the particular occupation, business, what they do, their income. Obviously, if you've got a particular product or service that's suited towards a particular person's income, they need to have over and above something, etc. And you want to have that in there. What do they eat? Where do they eat? Where do they holiday? What are their beliefs? Favorite books, music, TV shows, What do they read? Magazines, what subscriptions they have. Are they on Facebook? Are they on LinkedIn? All those sorts of things, YouTube, etc. The blogs that they might be reading. What sort of things they might Google and search for. You really want to think about the hobbies that they might be doing, what they do in their free time. Another big one is clubs or organisations that they might be part of. Because if you want someone that's in the Rotary Club, for instance, then you obviously can target the Rotary Club. So, and even further to that is, what sort of conferences they might be going to, what interests they have from a learning point of view, what development they want, and then things like, what sporting club they might be a fan of, if they're a Broncos supporter, or maybe a Rabbitohs supporter now, those sorts of things. You want to work out what their what they do in their spare time as well as what they do in their business. So that's the sort of personal details that you want to be talking about. And then, Jeremy, do you want to talk about the business type details as well?
Yeah, for sure. And I think just to reiterate, some people might be thinking as they're listening or watching this, what are all those personal details? Why are they important? Well, it helps you actually find that person, and it actually, it also might help you figure out where to advertise to them. For instance, won't it, Craig?
Yeah, absolutely. Then if they're a Broncos supporter, for instance, then you might be advertising through the Broncos Leagues Club or something like that. Yeah. So, it definitely gives you a target as to where you're going to go for marketing, for sure.
For sure. All right, so I'll talk about the business details. So this is where you want to really think about what their involvement in their business is. So things like, what is the level of their commitment to solving their problems? Because if you're providing a service or a product that solves problems, you want to make sure that the people that you're targeting are actually committed to those problems and aren't just stuck in the weeds all the time. You want to think about their level of commitment to achieving their goals. Are they the type of person that actually sets a goal? That can be really important. And then you really want to, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail now, a bit of a deeper dive. So you want to really think about becoming your ideal client avatar. Becoming the person that you want to work with. Think about what it's like to feel and think like them. Think about what it's like to, what they're actually thinking at the time that you start engaging with them. This is really important because if you can show that and figure that out, then you'll be able to really figure out how to sell to them and figure out what is actually going on in the very moment they're about to buy from you. And that's the other part of the deeper dive, or the second part of the deeper dive, is really, what are they thinking about? What are they thinking about when they buy from you, and how are they thinking about that? That can be really important. And what story are they telling to themselves? So we often talk about the fact that people think in pictures. We all think in pictures. That's just a human fact. And so you need to think about, what story are they telling themselves? What are they thinking about at the time when they purchase from you, so that you can help shape that picture in when you're talking to them or marketing to them. Once you've done that, you want to think about what their biggest problems are right now, in business especially, and what mistakes are they making right now as well. So you've got to step into their shoes and figure out what mistakes and what problems that they've actually got. And then the last question that a lot of people don't think about is, what's getting in the way of solving their problems. And this is thinking about really what's behind the problems that they're seeking, and then from that you'll be able to come up with a way to actually help solve their problems. And by using that, you can actually help them to help themselves through the business that you're having. And what you might find is that might cause them to really think about what they need in their business, and it might also change your business as well. So Craig, do you want to talk about how people can use the ideal client avatar stuff that we talked about in their business?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got all that information, you've built up your avatar, and then obviously what are you actually going to do with it? As we mentioned before, from a marketing point of view, you now know what those people are interested in, where they shop, what they do. So from a marketing point of view, you can target those particular areas, obviously. One of the other important things about the avatar is you don't just keep it to yourself as the owner of the business. You need to tell all of your staff and have everyone involved in the process, so they're now aware of who your ideal client are, so they know who to look out for as well when they're out and about networking or whatever it might be. They know that they're looking for a 42-year-old, whatever. So they know that if they see someone like that, that they can definitely introduce themselves and try to introduce the product or service that they're selling. So it's from a marketing point of view, networking point of view, and it's a way that you can keep control of who you're targeting. So you're not just getting every single customer or client through the door and working for them. You know that you're not looking for someone that's 36 and lives in Tasmania. You're looking for someone who's 42 and lives in Sydney. So things like that, if they come across, then you've got it there in writing to say to yourself, well, no, that's not my ideal client. Therefore, I don't want to be spending any time selling that product or that service to them. So it's a marketing and networking, a way of specialising or becoming an expert in that area. Is that's all you deal with on a daily basis. So it's important to get that right, obviously, because you don't want to be targeting the wrong ideal client. And you can manipulate it along the way if things pop up that you see are relevant as well. It's not something you just do at the beginning and then put in the bottom drawer or the second drawer, whichever one it is, that you never look at again. And,
second drawer, it's the
second drawer.
Yeah.
Pop it in the second drawer and never look at it again. This would be something that you'd be reviewing along the way where necessary. So I think that's probably the main reasons why you'd be using it in your business. Jeremy, did you have anything else?
No, I think that's right. I think that's important for people to understand. It's, a lot of the time, people might, business owners might think, oh, I don't need to think about these things, but you really do. They're really important, and they'll help you in the long term with your business and find that niche that actually can help people. So, Craig, why don't we move on to the second part of today, which was about engaging with your clients and customers. So once you've actually got your ideal client, how do you then engage with them? And I'll kick off, if you like, with the application form. And basically, so we're going to talk about application forms, and I'll talk about that. Craig's going to talk about engagement letters. I'll talk about terms and conditions. Craig will talk about unfair contract terms. I'll talk about personal guarantees and then privacy notices. And basically, all this comes together, and there's different ways to actually use these in your business. And we'll talk about the differences and where you might want to use them. So an application form really is dependent on the type of business that you operate. So if you're going to be providing any sort of credit for your clients or providing any sort of advice, then you need to have some sort of application form that actually gives clarity over what information you need for that person, and then attaching the terms and conditions, which I'll talk about a bit later, to it. These forms are really important because they're the contract that you have with your client. And so if you're selling, say, products in a store, you probably don't need an application form. But if you're selling those products and you're providing credit to your customers or clients, then you will need an application form. And the reason for that is that when you start in business and when you start with a client journey, everything's going to go well. Everyone thinks the same thing. Everything's going to go well. We don't have to worry about it. It's all good. Things go wrong. Even when you've just started out, in business, or you've been with the same client for 6 or 7 years, things change. So you need to have an application form that actually sets out the terms of the agreement. All too often, we see people come to us who don't have application forms in place, and they have problems with their clients or their customers, and it becomes very hard to actually enforce the debt that's owed to that customer because they don't have the right agreement in place. So make sure that you get an application form done properly. If you're not sure about it, get it drafted by a lawyer. It might cost you a little bit of money, but it's worth every single cent. Don't take them off the internet. That's a recipe for disaster. And so you need to make sure that you've got that all done properly. One of the other traps, and we'll talk about this throughout this term, is to make sure that when you're engaging with someone with an application form, that you actually put a legal entity in there. So if you go back to some of our previous shows where we talked about structures, or if you have a look at my book in chapter 4, structures, we talk about the different types of legal entities. You want to make sure that there's a company or an individual, someone that you can actually sue if they decide not to pay you for whatever reason later on. So application forms become really important, and they're something that people, often in business, we get it. We've been there. When you're in phase 3, it's all exciting. You're starting up, and you just want to start doing the work. Well, putting these things in place properly mean that you're not going to be left holding the bag later on. So that's an application form. Craig, do you want to talk about an engagement letter and how that's different?
Yeah, absolutely. So with anything, as Jeremy was saying, when you're engaging with your customers, be it through a credit application form, or if you were in a service-based industry, you're more likely to have some form of engagement letter. Either one, you've got to make sure that whoever you're engaging with is, as Jeremy said, a legal entity. And I'd take it even further than that, that someone may put down, Billy Bob's widgets, Pty Ltd. You also just want to double check that that's actually an entity, that the ACN and the ABN are correct, that it's not a deregistered company, those sorts of things. And there's no, depending on what industry you're in, you may even be doing credit checking on your new customers to make sure that there's no red flags there. That's the time to do it, not halfway through when you've already given them $10,000 worth of widgets. You want to be doing it at the beginning. So as part of this, you should have a credit policy in place. And we've spoken about that in previous shows. A credit policy in place to make sure that you're actually checking these details, because it's very important. So when you're doing the engagement letter, as I said, it's similar to an application form, but it's your letter to your prospective client outlining the terms of that engagement. So you'll see it a lot in the accounting industry, legal industry, those sorts of service-based industries. And your terms and conditions will be within that engagement letter. It's not as detailed as probably the terms and conditions that are in a product or a credit-based application and terms and conditions. Most important things are, and Jeremy's going to talk about it down the track, is personal guarantee. Those sorts of things can be weaved into an engagement letter. Also important that everyone, if there's more than one entity that you're dealing with, that they're all liable for the debt, or one person's liable for the debt. And we'd encourage everyone, if they can, to always have an individual as the person that's responsible rather than a company. Most companies are set up by for the purpose of asset protection, and most of the time the company may not have any assets that can be pursued if something goes wrong. And it's not just looking at it in the sense that we're putting all these things in place for the bad times. These sorts of applications, terms and conditions, engagement letters is a way of putting out there at the beginning of the relationship exactly what the terms are. So it's not just all one-sided to you as the provider. It has in there terms and engagement terms about what could happen if something happened to the service provider, et cetera, et cetera. So it's to govern the relationship. So if something does happen, either good or bad, there's terms there that we can all rely on. And we're not just saying that as lawyers and we want everything in writing, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a contract shouldn't be seen as one-sided, and it's definitely a joint engagement. So everyone's on the same page, which is something we also talk about a lot on the business legal lifecycle, shareholders agreements, and those sorts of things. So it's definitely something that shouldn't be thought about as some big bad thing that's you're going to use a big stick if something happens. It's engaging with them on the right basis at the beginning. So that's the engagement letter. Jeremy, do you want to now touch on something that we've mentioned throughout already, but terms and conditions and some of the good ones to consider when you're doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say this at the outset, and I do harp on this quite a bit in the show, but I think it's really important. Don't use terms and conditions that you get off the internet or that you borrow from someone else's documents. Craig, you do a lot of this type of work, and how many times do you see terms and conditions that someone has borrowed from someone else or borrowed from the internet that are just wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. The big one is that it's referring to, the Hague Convention or some legislation that's not relevant for the particular area. Yep. So, or just the terminology is just totally different to that jurisdiction. So, this is not the time for copy and pasting. It's the time to seek the right advice for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that aside, and we are very serious about that. It's not that anyone has ill intentions. It's just that different laws around the world require different things. As Craig said, the Hague Convention doesn't really apply in Australia, and US laws about use of money don't apply either. So just make sure that if you do want to do that, get it checked over by a legal professional or a debt collector who knows what they're doing. So Terms and conditions are really the conditions and terms of the contract that will apply to either the engagement letter or the application form. So a good terms of conditions and trade will set out the conditions that will be beneficial to you and also beneficial to your client or customer in case, as Craig said, something goes wrong and they need to know what they need to do. So they need to include a variety of different things, including the terms of payment. You want to make sure that you're really clear about when you're to be paid, whether that be before you do the work, which is ideal, or shortly after you've done the work, or before you provide the product, cash on delivery, all those things. Interest on late payments. So if when you've set down the terms of payment, and whether that be 7 days and they pay you on the 14th day, you might want to charge interest on that amount because essentially you're the customer's bank for that period of time. How goods and services will be delivered and provided. So they're setting out the actual way that the goods and services will be provided so that there's certainty over that. That's really important too. Liability and how it passes to the client and customer. So that might be if you're providing a good or a service and liability shifts to the client customer, then you want to be able to say how that passes to that client or customer. Any promises or warranties that you're providing to the client or customer for your business. This is really important again because there are certain ones that are set out in statutes, not just in Australia, but in the UK and the US too, and other countries. So you want to set out what those warranties are and how they're provided. If you're providing goods or services, how defective goods or services will be dealt with, how any default will be dealt with. All these things are things that, if something does go wrong, when you come to your lawyer, they're going to ask you, well, what are the terms and conditions? And it can make it very difficult for you to say, oh, well, I just thought we'd sort that out later. Well, then, you're stuck with the law and the way that the law works. So, you just need to have these things set out. If you're going to provide credit, how that will be provided, how the agreement can be terminated. Again, really important. The law doesn't have some set way of terminating a contract in most cases. You should set those out. Who owns intellectual property? So if you're, especially for a service business, if you're generating intellectual property for your customer or client, you want to set out how that intellectual property is going to be owned or how ownership is to be transferred. Security, this is a big one. So in Australia, we have a thing called the Personal Property Securities Register. And if you're going to take security over the assets, there's a certain procedure that has to be applied. That legislation changes from time to time, so you need to make sure that you've got a competent lawyer who is on top of these things, so that they can be changed if they change in the future. And the last one is if you're a goods business, how those goods will be returned if there's a problem. So you might have a returns policy. So you need to make sure that that's set out in stone. These things are really important, and they're really, like any good contract, they're setting out what happens if something goes wrong, and also defining the relationship so that there's a mutual understanding. Because it's amazing how people's different understanding of their agreements varies, and it's better to have them set out in black and white so that there can be no argument on those points. Now, the other point on that, just before we move on to unfair contract terms, is that a good terms and conditions will address all of the really common situations, but there will always be situations which can't be included in terms and conditions. So you need to be prepared to deal with disputes if they arise. The idea of it, though, is that you've got everything set out as best you can in your correspondence and in your terms and conditions so that can't happen. Greg, did you want to say anything else about terms and conditions before we move on to unfair contract terms?
No, I don't think so. I think, I'll cover it in this section. Unfair contract terms, as Jeremy said. So you've got your terms and conditions, you've got your application form or your contract. In Australia, you now need to be conscious of the unfair contract term protections that have come out in the Australian consumer law. And if you are covered under that, so there's certain criteria that you need to meet in order to be a small business. There's less than 20 people, including casual, and then it depends on how much the actual contract's for and over what period of time. We think it's good practice to have consider these unfair contract terms regardless of what you are, because it's as I said before, it's good practice to not be too unfair when you're dealing with your customers, and make sure that you're not going to get into any strife with Australian consumer law in the future. So it's relatively new in Australia, so there isn't that many decisions about it. the examples about what could be considered unfair is they're looking at it from the basis that it covers standard form contracts where it's a contract that's presented to a customer or prospective customer, and it's really on a take it or leave it basis. There's not here's our contract, please come back to us with any changes. It's, oh, you wanted $10,000 worth of widgets on credit, here's our application form, sign it and we'll give it to you. So it's a take it or leave it basis, where there isn't any, well, they could try to change it, but it really isn't. It's a, here it is, and sign it or don't sign it, but we're not dealing with you. So when it's like that, that's where they're trying to even up the imbalance there from an unfair contract term type situation. So the examples that are out there at the moment are things like a rolling contract that is for 12 months. However, in order to terminate that after the 12 months, you need to give notice 6 months before. So you can see that there's unfairness to that it's for 12 months, and all of a sudden you need to give notice halfway through it that you're terminating at the end of 12 months. Most people will miss that time, and that could be considered to be an unfair contract term, and you can kind of see why that would be the case, because they're relying on people to not really think about terminating something halfway through, and more likely to think about it 3 months before, a month before, those sorts of time frames that most people would have out there. So it's important to consider those and make sure that if you are thinking about putting something in there that might be considered unfair, that you potentially water it down a little bit. It doesn't mean that the whole agreement is void. It's only those particular terms that are considered to be unfair that are void. The rest of the agreement can stand, unless everything's unfair, but that would be very unlikely. So the agreement will still stand. It's just the particular unfair terms that will be classed as void, and there'll be certain ramifications for that. Obviously, you won't be able to enforce it, those particular clauses, or there could be penalties, etc. So definitely something you need to consider when you're doing this. And I guess the same with when we're talking about the client avatar, your terms and conditions and the way you engage with your customers, again, it's not something you put in place at the beginning and then never look at it again. Things change along the way, like the unfair contract terms. There's changes in relation to whether or not contracts are automatically terminated if a company goes into voluntary administration, those sorts of things as well. You need to make sure you keep up to date and not fall foul of changes in the legislation, which goes back to the fact that you need to have a good team behind you of advisors that can keep you up to date and make sure everything's kosher. So that's unfair contract terms. And one of the most important things from this sort of area, Jeremy, if you want to move on to that, is personal guarantees.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So, as Craig said, this is really, really important. So, if you're distracted, don't get undistract yourself right now, or pause this and come back to it when you're less distracted. Personal guarantees make the people behind an entity liable. Now, what do I mean by that? Previously, if you're regularly watching the show or listening to the podcast, you'll know that we've talked about structures. Structures like companies are very, very common. So companies are separate legal entities from the people behind them. That means that it has directors, it has shareholders, but those directors and shareholders are not liable for the debts of the company, except in very limited circumstances. One of those is a personal guarantee. So if you're providing credit of any sort, so whether you've got an application form, an engagement letter, and you've got terms and conditions, you need to have a personal guarantee attached to that if you're engaging with clients or customers who are companies or trusts or anything other than an individual. Now, the law was set up 100 years ago. I think it's right that you can set up these other entities as separate legal entities from people, personally. The issue with it is that what that means is that as a business owner and someone who, if you do provide credit to another business, that you need to have a personal guarantee to make the directors liable or the people behind the company liable. Now, I used the word directors before. There is a bit of a misnomer, a bit of a misunderstanding that a director's guarantee, if it's called that, only applies while the person is a director of the company. That's not the case. A director's guarantee, unless it says, and it's very unusual, unless it says that the person's only liable while they're a director, they'll be liable for the whole duration of the agreement. So you want to have a personal guarantee that makes the people behind the company or the trust personally liable for all of the debts. If you don't have it done properly, can become very difficult, and if not impossible for us to, as lawyers, to enforce it for you. If the entities aren't written out correctly, then you're going to have problems. So if you're providing credit to any sort of person for any sort of service or product, you need to make sure you have a personal guarantee from the person behind that entity that shows that they're going to pay that debt. So personal guarantee is really, really important, as Craig said. Did you want to add anything on that, Craig? Because I know you do a lot of that type of work as well.
Yeah, I would add as well that if you're, as part of your agreement, if you've got a personal guarantee and you present that to a prospective customer and they refuse to sign it or cross it out, then I would say alarm bells should be going off at that point, and you really need to consider whether or not you want to be doing business with that particular company. Is it the case that they may not have been in a great financial position and they're shopping around and using your credit as they've used other people's, and they don't want to sign a personal guarantee? Some people just don't sign them, but they're perfectly fine business. So if someone doesn't want to sign it, that's your opportunity to consider that, and you can still proceed, obviously, but it's definitely something that if they don't want to sign it, then you would, if you haven't already, you need to be doing your checks into that company to make sure that from a credit point of view, they're low risk, I guess is the best way of describing it. So you need that in your policy that someone's looking into that. If you're depending on the size of your business, when you're doing these sorts of things, we normally suggest that there's one person that's responsible for checking over the signed documents to see if everything's been signed. I think that's probably a big one that we haven't mentioned yet. And one of those is to check to see if the personal guarantee is obviously signed, witnessed, those sorts of things, so you can rely on it in the future. And then it's up to that one person to tick the box to say, yes, they're now a credit customer, or they're now a customer, whatever it is, and they've done their checks and measures to make sure everything is cool to go. So that's personal guarantees. The last thing we wanted to talk about today was privacy notices. So most of the time when you're doing your application, your terms and conditions, personal guarantee, you'll have some form of privacy notice in either your engagement letter or as a separate form in your bundle of documents from a credit application. Obviously, there's lots of different legislation around the world about privacy, but you'll find that most places will have something about privacy given the amount of information that people now obtain during a contract or an agreement. So the privacy notice is about what information you're going to obtain from that person, how you're going to store it, if they need access to it or would like to amend something, the process for that. It also gives you the ability, if it's a properly drafted privacy notice, to talk about doing those credit checks that I spoke about at the beginning. And also, if something does happen and you do not get paid, provided you have it in your terms and conditions and you've listed in your privacy notice, then you can do a credit default listing with the relevant organisation, Equifax, whatever it might be in your particular place. And that's where your credit rating is affected. So there'll be a credit listing there that they didn't pay such and such, and that affects their credit. And it's amazing how many times a credit listing will go on a file, you don't hear from them, and then 6 months later they're trying to get a car loan or some other loan, and they're contacting you about that credit listing and wanting to pay it. So basically, you want to have all these sorts of things at your disposal. It doesn't mean you're going to use your terms and conditions, your personal guarantee, the privacy notice, all those sorts of things, but at least if you have it there, if something ever does go wrong, let's hope it never does, you've got all those to use at your discretion to put you back where you should have been had they paid you at the beginning. So important to have all these documents in place. As I said, if someone doesn't want to sign something, it's your opportunity to look further into that and make a considered decision as to whether or not you want to be doing business with them. So privacy notice, important to look at, as you are going to be getting information about people, making sure it's secure, those sorts of things, and you're not breaching a particular privacy legislation in the particular country. If you do have these documents in place and they've been in place for a while, there have been changes, as I said, in the unfair contract terms. There's also been changes in Australia to the particular sections of the Privacy Act that no longer exist. So make sure if you have done one of those a while ago to get it out and have a look at it, just to make sure it's up to date and you won't cause any problems. So I think that's it for us today, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's a good comprehensive outline of engaging with your clients. As always, as Craig said earlier, we've got our show notes. If you go to businesslegallifecycle.com.au/156, you'll see the show notes there. We'll also have a workbook for today's episode going through all that information. And we'll be back on Monday with Fast Fix Monday. And as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to email us, jump on Facebook, send us a message. There's many ways to contact us. Just search for Business Legal Lifecycle on Facebook, on YouTube, and we'll be able to come back to you with any advice that you need. And if you're listening to the podcast, please feel free to, if you like it, go onto Apple Podcasts and review us, or any of the other podcast platforms, because that will help other people to find our information. Greg, I think that's it for today, and we'll be back on Monday.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.